You're listening to Eating for Eden, Episode 9. When it comes to doing something about climate change, your food choices matter. Thanks for tuning in to Eating for Eden, a podcast that takes a food-first approach to climate action. I'm your host, Jessica J. Schroeder, and I am passionate about food that tastes good and does good. I'll guide you with practical tips and help you thoroughly enjoy your food along the way. Thanks for tuning in to Eating for Eden. Today we have our first guest interview, and I'm thrilled to welcome to the show Chris MacAskill. Chris was lucky enough as a young teen to caddy for the legendary Jack LaLanne, who kindled his interest in nutrition and exercise. He is a Stanford-trained earth scientist who spent some of the 80s in water testing when the horrors of chemical pollution in animal agriculture became so clear, making it clear how critical our food production systems are for human health, the planet, and every living thing. He spent a few decades in Silicon Valley tech, where average life expectancy is 85, among the highest in the world right here in America, and plant-dominant diets have become cool. He has a YouTube channel, Plant Choppers, about plant-dominant diets and their profound impact on human health and a clean, healthy planet. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a joy to have you.
Lovely to be here. Congratulations on your new podcast.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you. So I'd like to begin with letting our listeners get to know you a bit. So would you be willing to share a bit about your background and what you're doing now?
Yeah, it depends on how far back you want to go. My background is a little bit crazy. My mom got a master's degree from Cornell in organic biochemistry, went into cancer research. She was beautiful. She was runner-up for homecoming queen at USC. And then she tragically got struck by adult schizophrenia when she was 35, when she was pregnant with me. And schizophrenics, it's just a tragic life they live and they lead. And so I lived with my grandparents while she was confined to an insane asylum, as they were called in the day, until I was 7. And then somehow she got out, came to California, probably because of our liberal mental illness laws, I don't know. She sent a telegram to my grandparents saying, "Send Christopher," and they did. They loaded me on a TWA jet connecting in Chicago when I was 7, and I started living with my mom. And it wasn't long before she withdrew me from school because she was afraid the communists would get us, because it was the McCarthy scare in the era. He was a senator who was saying the communists bug your telephone lines, and they do all kinds of terrible things. So I missed a lot of elementary school, somewhere along second grade, third, fourth, and fifth. And then I got, my father got custody of me. I went to live with him in sixth grade, but I never did confess to anyone all those years of missing school. So it was kind of traumatic going from an all-black neighborhood in Oakland. I didn't know a single white kid. One Japanese boy, but we treated him terribly because of was the day, and they had invaded Pearl Harbor. And then to an all-white upper middle-class neighborhood. It was just crazy. And my father had to get me out of juvenile hall because I got caught for shoplifting, because that's one of the ways we survived. So he thought I was a criminal and I needed rehab. And so he made me earn all my own money for everything. And so I mowed lawns and delivered papers. And at I think 14, I got a job with as a caddy at a country club. They used to have young teens carry their golf bags and rake the traps and all that. And I guess I was good at it, and the caddy master liked me, and so he assigned me Jack LaLanne and Rick Barry, who was a forward for the Warriors, very famous, the NFL's or the NBA's most valuable player. They won a championship. He was 6'7" and skinny, and Jack was, I don't know, 5'6" and very muscular. And one of the first times I met Jack, I was sipping an orange soda that I'd bought. It was like 5 cents. It was a lot of money. And he convinced me to pour it out and never drink another one. And when we would go to the 11th, when you get to the 11th hole, there was a snack bar, and the golfers were supposed to buy their caddies something to eat, and I would always order, like all the caddies, a Butterfinger bar or Baby Ruth bar, Snickers, some big candy bar.
Mm-hmm.
And he would only allow me peanuts or raisins, and raisins were disgusting. So of course I got the peanuts. and and but what was really significant about it is my whole family on the MacAskill side were into low carb diets. They had been from the 30s. They've always been super popular. Here's the family book from the 30s.
It wouldn't be a Chris MacAskill interview if there wasn't a book appearance.
Yeah, flashing books around. And that book warned against low carb or carbs because they created fermentation in the gut. And it was the Bible for my grandparents. And of course, they died in their 60s. And I think Grandpa had a heart attack when he was 62. And then my father stuck with it and fell for every low carb diet there was. I mean, we were nearly carnivore. Every night it was steak or liver or something like that. But he was declining in his health so badly with gout and high blood pressure and weight gain, and he eventually got cancer, and then he had a heart attack before my age. Now I'm 70. And so I used to talk to Jack about it, and Jack would tell him, Jack's advice to me was, if it comes from a cow or a pig, don't eat it. If it comes from a factory made by man, don't eat it. I want you to eat, he would tell me, I want you to eat like 4 or 5 fruits every day or more, and like 8 vegetables a day. And it's like, no, who does that? That's crazy. And he would eat poultry, and he would eat fish and egg whites. And he became famous for his juicer and everything. Anyway, when my dad died at a heart attack of 70, and he was in really bad shape, Jack was out towing 70 boats with 70 people in them, swimming, handcuffed and shackled on live television across a bay that was more than a mile long. That's how robust he was.
Wow.
And he lived till he was 96. I mean, you can Google it. It's online. It just seems unbelievable. When you see him get out of the water, look how good he looked at 70. So that left a really deep impression on me. But my father said, yeah, but Dr. Atkins is a doctor. Jack LaLanne is a gym rat. So I asked Jack about that, and he said, no, I was going to be a doctor, but I decided I could save more people through prevention than through doctoring. And so that's why I did what I did. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, very interesting. And but then I sort of, my dad had a good point that Dr. Atkins and all the others, were doctors. None of them made it out of their 70s, but they were doctors, and they sold millions and millions of books. And it wasn't until I became an earth scientist, graduated from Stanford, and went into earth science that I was involved in water testing and got to see the horrors of the chicken farms and so on, and how the amount of pollution they engendered, how these chickens were turning into Franken chickens like we'd never eaten before. Same with cattle and pigs, and the chemical pollution. And I thought back to Jack and thought, this is really a critical topic. And so I've never forgotten it, and now I devote my life to it.
Terrific. I just feel like there's so much in what you said too, not only understanding your background, but hopefully listeners can become more aware of things that they maybe haven't heard before about the way that their food is produced. So one thing, Chris, that really drew me to your YouTube videos is the fact that you're really good at pointing out pseudoscience and then shining the spotlight on true science, separating the fact from the fiction. And while I often leave feeling inspired, knowing that there is scholarly consensus, I also tend to end up feeling frustrated by how much misinformation and disinformation is out there, kind of cluttering up the web. So I'm curious in that vein, what are some of your thoughts on pseudoscience? How can we distinguish between pseudoscience and trustworthy sources? And are there any red flags that you might point us to watch out for?
Yeah, social proof is a really big one, especially in the age of the internet. So a little bit of background. One of my favorite books of all time was from Carl Sagan. Science is like a candle in the dark. I don't know how long ago I read it, but just a few months ago I read it because I was so shaken up by one of the carnivore doctors who's exploded on the scenes, Anthony Chafee, the plant-free MD. And some of the claims he makes are just like, what are you talking about? I just didn't understand. So on a long drive, I re-listened to Carl Sagan's book, and one of the things he was dealing with in his age was UFO sightings. There were a million of them, a million UFO sightings, and some people were convinced they'd been abducted, and they had very vivid memories of it, and how could you handle that? Because he just couldn't find evidence for it. All the photos were fuzzy, and I mean, they could refer to very credible people like Air Force pilots who saw him on the radar. But as he would chase those down, I don't know how you chase down a million of them, but as he would chase those down, it was like, this doesn't look like it's holding up very well. And I think that whole thing is fading, as have, so many other things like that over the centuries. But I think the summary of that book was, number one, it's very difficult to believe anything but what you want to believe. We're humans, we're so fragile. You really want to believe something, you can figure out how to believe it, especially if your education is a little bit lower, education level is a little bit lower, or you don't have any scientific background. Even scientists have a really difficult time, they want to believe something, their career depends on it because they published something 10 years ago about it. And
that confirmation bias is definitely a real thing.
Yeah, it's a real big thing. So that's one. The other thing that he mentioned was social proof. When you've got, how can you argue with, how can 1 million people be wrong about UFO sightings? 1 million people, that's a lot. And official reports and everything else. So in my last couple of episodes, I've mentioned a couple of things that Anthony Chafee says. Some of them just cause me to snap my head back. One, for example, he's on the cover of a Woman's World magazine. It's a tabloid in the supermarkets with big circulation, 1.6 million circulation. And but the visual impressions people get waiting in the supermarket stand are so much higher than that. And right on the cover, he has the carnivore diet is Harvard approved. Well, Harvard, no. All you have to do is a simple Google search and see that Harvard says it's a bad idea. And the other thing he says is he quintupled his calorie intake. So let's suppose he's eating 3,000 calories a day because he's a big boy. He could quintuple that to 15,000 calories a day, and he lost 23 pounds in 10 days. Maybe, but don't you think with a claim that dramatic,
should cause us to pause?
Yeah, you want to see some evidence. So I bought a new book. Dan Ariely, he wrote a book called Predictably Irrational. He's a sociologist, I think, and a really good researcher, has a great reputation. And he's out with a new book that he calls Disbelief or Misbelief. It's fascinating, and I'm halfway through that book. Oh my gosh, it's just so fascinating. The premise is we all know people who went down the funnel of misbelief, and we say, how did that person come to believe what they believe? And it estranges them from their families, and the whole thing. Nobody wants to talk to them about it, and they could be an otherwise rational person. And once they go down one funnel of misbelief, they tend to go down a lot of others. So how does that happen? So he goes chapter by chapter on the research that he's done over the years on how that happens. And some of the stuff was, I think, very fascinating. Social proof, wanting to believe, of course, just like Carl Sagan said. But there were a lot of other factors. One is if you're stressed about something, you've got a cancer diagnosis, or you've got Crohn's disease or something like that, and the doctors are saying, well, we don't know exactly what caused it. Parkinson's disease. What caused it? We're not exactly sure of the cure and so on. It sends you, quite frenetically hoping for anything you can find, to prove your doctor wrong, that there is a cure. There must be a cure. How could I live with this disease? And so that's a risk factor for going down the disinformation highway. A little bit of narcissism helps a lot. It's linked to going down that path. We all have some narcissism, and his advice, and I shouldn't joke about this, but his advice on narcissism is narcissists want attention. They want to feel loved. They want to feel important. They want to feel, like they're smart and all those things. The best thing you can do is give your narcissist a hug and give them some positive reinforcement that they're fine, they're okay, and valuable and everything else, or that they could slip down that path too. What else did he say? I'm thinking about doing an episode just about Anthony Chaffee. I don't like doing those episodes. My heroes are scientists, great scientists who, have landmark publications and so on. That's what I love to do. That's why I came into this field for. But no, if I don't say something about some of the misinformation, who will? I just don't see it out there. And so Dan, has just a whole book full of really valuable information about, what causes you to tumble down this information path. Social is so powerful because not only is it social confirmation, but also it's your tribe. People respect you, believe in you. You feel like you're respected because you've come up with information not even doctors and scientists know. And, they're full of, positive vibes. You go into a forum and they don't allow anything negative. So you're in a bubble. And then they give you congratulations for turning up this, turning up that, and so on. Not having much statistical background, so you derive correlations where they don't exist, and you're seeing all kinds of patterns that really don't exist. It's like baseball players. Why have I struck out 6 times in a row? Well, that's just probability. That's what happens. It's not the underwear you're wearing. It's just if you get on base 30% of the time, well, there's going to be times when you have 6 strikeouts in a row or don't get on base or whatever it is. But baseball players don't have a statistical background, so they don't know that, and they say, well, the socks I was wearing all those times when I struck out, I was wearing those socks. It could be the socks.
So I heard you say some things like paying attention to the kinds of claims that are being made. If something sounds outlandish, like saying that Harvard is promoting the carnivore diet, that things like that don't necessarily equal pseudoscience, but it's like back to my question about red flags. Those kinds of things can clue us into, I think I might need to look into this a little bit more. And like you said, even just a quick Google search on some of these things can clarify that that's not correct. Or even, when it does get a bit more into, let's say, studies that certain people are referencing or other books that maybe you haven't read, and it might take a bit more time to, say, read a whole book or to dive into a scientific study or meta-analysis that you don't have the training to understand. It might be trying to find someone like yourself or other people who have also read those studies that can help clarify what's really going on there. I'm wondering.
Yeah.
Oh, so go ahead if you were to say anything else.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt, but I did remember something as you were talking about like checking Harvard and so on. I remembered something that Dan Ariely said that was maybe the elephant in the room. As soon as you lose trust in an institution or scientists, that is the gateway drug to go down this path. And Matt, that's why, if you think the U.S. government was behind the collapse of the towers and on 9/11. By the way, I was at Ground Zero when that happened,
Oh,
volunteering in a medical tent of all things. If you think the government was behind that, so you learn to distrust the government, or you think that because you distrust the government, well, you might mistrust Harvard and Stanford and so on. So when you do the Google search and you see what Harvard says, you just discount it and say, no one believes Harvard anymore because the president of Harvard said something anti-Semitic. I don't know what. So this is the thing that Carl Sagan didn't know, and then Ariely doesn't know, I don't think, and most nutrition scientists don't know. But your strength is your weakness. Your weakness is your strength. I haven't been in nutrition science as a PhD nutrition scientist all my life, but I have had a lot of time in industry. I worked for Steve Jobs. He was the master marketer. And we knew, I learned so much about marketing and human behavior and how to influence it from that. And one of the things the American Cattlemen's Association does, they're genius marketers.
yeah.
They know men love masculinity and women love beauty. Their product is doubt. That's all big companies. Their product is doubt. When it comes to meat, when it comes to processed foods, when it comes to most of the American diet, the science doesn't look favorably on it. What the science looks favorably on is fruits and vegetables, and those are not profitable to sell. It's just little sort of boutique companies that sell that because it spoils on the shelf. You can't brand it and so on. What's profitable to sell are things like Doritos, where you can package it and patent it and have your own formula and so on. And so everything they do is around casting doubt and trying to cast doubt on our institutions, our nutrition scientists, and so on. For example, Nina Teicholz wrote this book, The Big Fat Surprise. It shows a steak on the cover with butter and a halo over it, and talking about how meat and butter belong in a healthy diet. Well, if you look at the pattern of what she does, she's quite tied to the industry. You see photos of her speaking at some dairy council or the Cattlemen's Association, whatever. When you see the patterns of what she does, she isolates the most prominent scientists. That would be Ansel Keys, most prominent scientist of all time in nutrition. Second would be Walter Willett, the former chairman of Harvard School of Public Health. Probably the third now is Christopher Gardner, who I just had dinner with last night, and we talked about this issue. And in all of what she does is she makes up things. I mean, they're fictional things about those three people and scientific papers and so on. She just makes it up. I don't know why she doesn't get sued for defamation or whatever. But they're demonstrably false, the statements that she makes, and she gets so many people to believe it. Why? Because bacon and butter and beef are delicious.
Things that we want to hear, right?
Yeah, we want to hear that. They really are delicious. No one wants to hear that your mom wants you to eat broccoli, or at least not until you get a taste for it. Maybe if you come from the Mediterranean area where they fix it with deliciousness, olive oil and garlic, maybe you like it, but a lot of people growing up say, I'll take the burger.
Sure. I'm curious, with statements like what you said, Nina Teicholz, say about Walter Willett, something that you brought up in recent episodes of your on your YouTube channel. I'm curious, how would someone even know that they need to fact check something like that? I think for the average consumer, when they're just seeing things thrown around on Twitter and on TikTok and Instagram and in YouTube, how do we learn how to be more responsible consumers of media, even if we don't have formal training in the sciences?
Yeah, so on this episode that I'm thinking about doing with Anthony Chafee for his astounding claim that plants are trying to kill you, and his reference to that is a professor at Berkeley who was a giant in the field and one of the most cited scientists of all time, Bruce Ames. Bruce's whole message was the lower quartile of fruit and vegetable consumers are twice as likely to get cancer as the upper quartile of fruit and vegetable consumers. He was all about, in his headlines, your mom was right, eat your fruits and vegetables. And yet, Anthony is quoting him as the guy who says they're carcinogenic and you can't eat them, they're trying to kill you. And it doesn't take much of a Google search to figure that out, but nobody's doing it. And I don't know why.
It just sounds like a very easy misreading of what that study is actually claiming.
Yeah. And so in the talk that he gave at Low Carb Down Under, he got 1 million views. Plants are trying to kill you. And he put up a screenshot of what he called that study. It was actually an article from the Scientist magazine written by anonymous staff at the Scientist. And they quoted Bruce Ames along with a couple other scientists that they quoted. And the quote that they had in there of Bruce Ames was the number of the chemicals by weight that are carcinogenic or mutagenic to your DNA in vegetables by weight is much higher than the pesticides on the fruits and vegetables. And the point that he was making is that some of these pesticides are in very small amounts, and they're just not in the amount that should cause a concern. That was the context. And the reason the article was being written is they were trying to defend alar, which was the thing they put on apples to make them shiny. And but if you read any article by him to get an explanation of that sentence, he says, well, the thing is that plants have antioxidants and non-mutagenic vitamins, and they are so much more powerful than the mutagenic and carcinogenic nature of the chemicals in them that they're protective, unlike pesticides, which do not have antioxidants or non-mutagenic vitamins in them. So, the pesticides should be more threatening than what's in the fruits and vegetables because they don't contain those. But they're also in small amounts, so in most cases, they appear to be harmless. That's what he was saying. But if you take it out of context with an article written by the Scientist and you don't actually go to the actual words of Bruce Ames, you get the whole wrong idea. 1 million people watching that thing probably decided no more vegetables for me. That's scary. I don't want to be killed by vegetables. Why didn't people know that? I don't trust government, and I don't trust nutrition scientists and all that. And why don't I trust them? Well, because for one thing, Nina Teicholz and the Cattlemen's Association and any number of food companies are genius marketers who know their product is doubt, and they cast doubt on those institutions and scientists. And so we go down the channel of misinformation. Dan Ariely's book is genius.
I think any of us, even if we have a sense of some skin in the game, saying, I feel like I lean toward this way of eating or this way of eating, or maybe, bringing it to climate change. I have this perspective on climate change, or, this other perspective. I think it's good for us all to bear in mind that we need to be willing to read and listen to a variety of voices to test what's really true. And I think you've really modeled this well, Chris, that you don't just say, just because it's plant-based or vegan or whatever, doesn't mean that there isn't potentially some flaw in the logic or in this, the way the science is being presented, that you're really good at diving down and really seeing what was said, how long was the study, is this reproducible, et cetera. And I think that for those of us that want to learn and are finding claims being made out there, particularly on social media where things can get a little blown out of proportion, it's a little understatement of the century. Yep. It's good for us to just take the time and do a quick Google search to fact check and maybe go a little deeper and try to find people who are speaking from both sides, so we can really weigh what evidence really seems to be holding water here.
Yeah, I agree. I sometimes despair a little bit and think, we knew more in the 70s, in late 60s and 70s when I was a caddy. As a general population, than we know now, because we had people like Jack LaLanne, and he was just, he was fit, he was masculine, he was handsome, he was charismatic. He had a TV show for 36 years on doing exercise to improve your physique. He wrote 10 books, I think. He lived till he was 96 and was active all those years and pulled stunts like swimming, towing 70 boats when he was 70. He was just so good at it. And he just left a big vacuum when he died, because it's allowed, giant food companies, and they are much more giant now, and they have much more sophisticated marketing, and we know much more about their lobbying efforts and their disinformation efforts and everything else. And they, the food companies are winning a lot of battles over our health. It's tragic.
Yeah. I feel like this is a good segue to talk a little bit more about your YouTube channel, Plant Chompers. I'm curious if you want to share with our listeners, what is your goal with this channel, and what does success look like for you, or how do you know that you're reaching that goal?
Well, so that's a good question. I just feel like plant dominant diets. It doesn't really matter to me if it's vegan, vegetarian, Mediterranean, Asian, what it is, as long as it's plant dominant. I'm reading another book and I can't think of the name of the title. I didn't recognize the author, but somebody told me it was a good book, so I started reading. And it is that plant-based companies who sell plant-oriented foods, Impossible, Beyond, and any number of others, their executives know that it's the reducers that have the big impact on the planet and on human health. It's not the people at the very pointy end of the plane, the vegans and the vegetarians, because they represent a small amount of the population. The larger part of the population are the people who are reducing. They're going for meatless Mondays, or maybe only having meat after, for dinner, but not for lunch and breakfast and so on. That's where the big gains are. And being an earth scientist, I like to keep up with the latest thinking from earth science. And Hannah Ritchie is a PhD environmental scientist. Yeah,
I got her new book. Yeah.
And, it's a great book. I don't know if you've started reading it yet, but she takes a very positive, optimistic view on we can be the first generation to actually stop climate change. Some earth scientists push back on her a little bit, saying that's a little optimistic, Hannah. But I like it. But one of the things she points out in there, we're not going to get people to stop eating meat. It's too attractive, and it has social status and everything else associated with it, masculinity, all the marketing in the beef industry. But we are becoming successful at getting them to reduce, and that's where the big action is. So, I happen to be vegan, and I've been vegan for a very long time, but that's because I'm an earth scientist, and we earth scientists are freaked out about what's happening to the earth. That's a whole nother story. I don't know any earth scientists like Hannah Ritchie who aren't vegan. We just seem to see what no one else sees. We're out in the field and we see it. We see the data, and I just don't think anybody else wants to see it, or their lives are still comfortable. I don't know what it is. We earth scientists, we're just baffled. We don't know why it is.
Yeah, we want to hear, and then we reject what we don't want to hear, unfortunately.
I know. We can't understand. And my own generation, my second son told me at dinner the other day, we have to wait for the boomers to die to make progress on this. And it's like, but wait, we're the ones who were doing all the protests in the late 60s and 70s. We got the EPA started. We pressured Nixon into establishing the EPA. We saved the Columbia River Basin. We saved Lake Erie from all that pollution. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. I mean, we are breathing the cleanest air humans have ever breathed because of the Clean Air Act. And we thought we were making so much progress. Toxic sprays that hurt the ozone layer, knowledge of the greenhouse effect in the 80s and how it was warming the planet, which we made the models and predictions then that have held almost till today. Now we're exceeding those models, but we did all those things, and we were passionate about it. We just didn't see ExxonMobil coming along with their disinformation campaign, or the Koch brothers, or the Murdoch media empire. It just, and somehow, we're losing this battle, and I just don't understand. I just don't understand how we're losing it. I noticed even in the voting in the UK, or in the European Union lately, there's a shift to the right, and part of that is because of climate policies that people don't want to adhere to. And it's like, oh my gosh, it goes straight to my soul.
Yeah.
I can understand migration and things like that, but the climate policies, do people not see? I thought when people saw what was going on around them, they would then believe our models, but they don't seem to. I don't get it.
Yeah, I wonder how much of it has to do with this sort of, oh, it's not affecting me, or they might be watching the news and seeing it affect, oh, that's too bad, it's happening over there, or that maybe that's just normal and it happens to be a really bad version of a hurricane or a flood or whatever, and they're just, until it really hits your own city, I think it's hard to see the need for that sacrifice. I think maybe that's what people are seeing it as. I have to give up so much to have to change if the government wants me to do this or that, or the person in power in my state or my city wants to put forth changes, and that's going to require me to change, and I don't want to change. I think that's probably, it comes down to an individual level of not being aware and willing that we all need to join forces together and be willing to do what it takes to create a sustainable planet.
Well, one of those changes is so simple. It's eat something besides beef, because beef is by far the outlier. It's 10 times at least the water use and land use and greenhouse gases and deforestation and de-wildlifing and everything else of any other kind of meat, except for maybe lamb. But we don't eat that much lamb anymore, I don't think. But you could still have chicken and fish and pigs if you're really into bacon. And so the current footprint of agriculture around the world is 4 billion hectares. I know it's hard to visualize, but the relative thing is the important thing. If we didn't eat beef, it would be 2 billion hectares.
Wow.
If we didn't eat dairy, it would be 1 billion hectares. So you could still eat the chicken and the fish, not the dairy, but the chicken and the fish and all the plants you wanted, and it'd only be 1 billion hectares, 1/4. We've deforested half the earth. When I gave my TEDx talk about this, I went on, I gave the talk with half a beard to symbolize the fact that, we've deforested half the earth. 80% of the deforestation of the Amazon is coming from beef, for leather for our couches and car seats and for burgers. Well, go to Chick-fil-A instead of going to McDonald's and get a chicken sandwich instead of, I don't like the way chickens are treated any more than anyone, and all the pollution that it creates. And, I'd rather they eat, plants, because beef is, while it's 10 times the impact of pork or chicken or fish, it's 100 times the impact of plants. You could pick on Southern California, almonds is using a lot of water, but generally,
they're also trees.
Yeah.
Right. So
trees.
They're drawing down carbon too.
Yeah. Yeah.
What you were just saying maybe. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking what you were just saying made me think of something I've heard Christopher Gardner say. I think it was when he was on Simon Hill's podcast talking about the swap meats trial, and how he's like, I would prefer for people to eat, chickpeas, lentils, etc. But like, to your point, if people aren't willing to go to the far extreme, what is a better option than beef?
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of better options.
Oh, so many. Anything's better. And I didn't even mention chemical pollution, cows. And people say things like vegans. So here's some misinformation for you. Vegans kill more animals than, because of the animals that are killed, little furry ones that are killed when the combine comes to. and we have to have so many row crops and everything else. Well, no, the conversion from plants to calories for a cow, because their four stomachs are so inefficient, it's just an archaic form of digestion, that you only get 3 calories out of beef for every 100 calories of plants you put in. And when people say, well, a lot of those plants aren't edible by humans anyway, like alfalfa. Yeah, we grow millions and millions of acres of alfalfa,
Only
which
for
we wouldn't
cows.
grow. Yeah, we wouldn't, we can't eat the alfalfa, but we wouldn't grow it if it weren't for the beef. And so, I mean, it goes on, and there's all kinds of misinformation propagated by General Mills about, it regenerates the soil more. No, just do a little bit of, watch one of my episodes about that.
That is a great plug, and I second that. Before we wrap up, Chris, is there anything else that you'd like the listeners to know about that you didn't get a chance to share yet?
Uh, you know, I often say that I don't know for sure that a vegan diet is the healthiest diet. Maybe a pescatarian diet is as healthier or healthier. I don't know. I think that's changing because of chemical pollution in the fish.
Mm.
People have extraordinary results with a Mediterranean diet that's plant dominant, with an Asian diet that's plant dominant, with a vegan diet where they, supplement with
Supplement.
B12.
Mhm.
And the Adventists have, I'm about to publish in a couple days a speech that I had Dr. Scharfenberg give, who's almost 101 now, and he's touring the world. He's an Adventist.
Does he drive it? He's someone that drives his red Prius.
Yeah,
That's
he drove
amazing.
3 hours so I could record this speech. And
Amazing.
uh, so I asked, I'm arranging a TEDx conference on October 1st in Boston. It's International Old Persons Day declared by the WHO. And so we're having the best speakers I could find, and I wanted John Scharfenberg to be there because he just strides right up on the stage and speaks boldly and gets a standing ovation and everything else. He said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't do it because I'm in the Czech Republic that day or Slovakia or someplace. And I just got back from Madagascar and Guam. I'm on a world tour, giving my talks about health. And well, how do you get there, John? Well, I drive my red Prius, of course. Well, are you carrying your bags between flights? Of course I do. It's like, so, he just strode right up on the stage for this talk we had him give. And then, of course, he got a thunderous standing ovation. He's never eaten a piece of meat in his life. He's been vegetarian all his life. And he eats some dairy. Is a vegan diet more healthy than what he's eating? I don't know. But what I do know is there are at least 6 things that separate a vegan diet. I mentioned the environment. It's not just what Hannah Ritchie's talking about. She's talking about the climate. She's not someone who's a specialist in water. For example, in my earth science days, I was involved in water testing, and the chicken farms, the foster farms in the 80s around on the East Coast are part of the Chesapeake Bay drainage area. So they produce this extremely burning, concentrated manure. You walk into one of those, you can't walk into them anymore because they keep them private. But when you walked into one of those in the 80s, your eyes would burn from the ammonia from their urine and how concentrated the manure was. And then it gets piled up outside and no one knows what to do with it. And then it seeps into the water table and goes down the streams to give kids cancer on the way down. And then it ends up in the Chesapeake Bay and kills all the bottom-dwelling animals like oysters and so on, and lobsters. And the fishermen get all upset, in Boston. And so they try to, or at least they did in the 80s, try to sue foster farms. But typically the company with the biggest balance sheet wins, and so foster farms win. And so, with our obsession for protein and meat and all that, we've gone chicken, and we eat about 3 times more per capita or something like that than we did in the 80s. And the chickens are 26 pounds now instead of 7 or 8 pounds, and they're Franken chickens. But it's made the pollution even worse. And so she doesn't really talk in her book about chemical pollution, but oh my gosh, it's like a nightmare. So for me, pathogens like E. coli and Salmonella, chemical pollution, the cruelty to animals, which are it's really barbaric. Everyone knows that. Even the people who eat a lot of meat don't like the treatment of animals. They all say we got to do something about that. Well, what are you going to do about it? There's nothing to do about it because the cheapest way to raise them is to turn them into Franken animals, and the ones that people are going to eat the most are the ones that are marbled, that have all that extra fat in them, and which the poor animals, it's like wrecking their metabolic health so you can have your marbled meat. And so, I have at least 6 reasons for being vegan, even though it isn't about necessarily health. I wouldn't mind a piece of fish now and then if it wasn't laden with chemicals.
Right, right. That's such a great thing to stress is that we know what we can know and then we don't know what we can't know for sure. That the way that science is and what we've
Yeah.
been able to learn so far means that there are still some limits and that each one of us needs to make a responsible decision within, what we know at the time. And like when I think back to my days in my master's degree, I was reading a lot about food at the time, and it was torture to go to the grocery store because I had a budget
Yeah.
and I had what I was hoping to buy. And then I was thinking if I was going to eat meat at that time, I wanted the best kind possible so it could, be better for the environment, better for the animal, et cetera. And I eat almost exclusively plant-based now, but I just remember that feeling of being so torn. And I think it's helpful for any listener who's wherever they are in their journey to recognize that even if they have the goal of becoming vegan, or if they find themselves there someday and they don't even expect to, reduce, and find better versions of the meat if you're going to eat the meat. But I think one point to bring in too is that for something like beef, you have a lot of people pointing to grass-fed, regenerate, quote unquote, regenerative beef. And I just want to make the point that we just don't have enough planet to do that well for the our global desire for meat just cannot be sustained on a way that's actually healthy for the environment or for the animals. So I hope that at least resonates with people to eat
Well, that
less.
famous General Mills report on White Oaks pastures, where
Right.
they claim that it regenerates the soil, which is a dubious claim, because what White Oaks pastures was doing was buying depleted land, overgrazed land, and then they were adding organic material to it for a couple of years, like hay and other organic materials. And so the soil was absorbing some carbon, but they also were buying feed at the feed store for the chickens and the pigs that they're releasing on the land because they're not really grazing animals. And it's that feed from the feed store that was supplementing the carbon. The cows that they're raising, they're getting, shipped to New York for a restaurant or to your neighborhood for McDonald's or something like that. That's carbon that's being removed. It's not the way the earth works with buffaloes and wolves. When a wolf kills a buffalo in Wyoming, they eat the buffalo and then they poop it out right there on the plains. The wolves don't ship it to New York for somebody to dine on. And they don't remove those buffalo from the land. So that White Oaks pasture thing is just fiction. But the one thing they had to admit is that grass-fed beef takes 2.5 times the land as stall-fed beef, CAFO, concentrated animal farm beef. And that gap is even widening because, now we know that immobilizing the animals makes them more tender and juicy. And so we pack them into close quarters, don't even let the pigs roll over or anything, or stretch out, I don't know.
Barbaric.
And but that whole General Mills report it was because they have this jerky brand that they sell, and they wanted to say it's grass-fed and regenerative, and people, that's genius marketing.
Mm-hmm. Well, for listeners, keep an eye out for that genius marketing. Question it. So finally, Chris, I just like to close with a fun question. Since I'm a foodie, and I think many of our listeners may be as well, what is maybe a favorite plant-based food or a meal that you've been enjoying a lot lately?
My wife has a recipe So I prepare some of the food. Mainly it's a green smoothie in the afternoon. I'm very sophisticated about my green smoothies. And she cooks a lot of food, and we buy produce and everything else. And she fixes oats with quinoa and wheat germ and everything else. And we add fruit to it and ground up flax seeds or chia seeds or something like that. But she has a recipe for dal that is a spicy bean dish with turmeric and I think she got it from Forks Over Knives. I'm not sure. I could email you and so you could put it in your show notes. But boy, is that good. And she makes big batches, and I put them in the refrigerator, and they're just as good the next day. So that's my favorite.
Nice. Thanks for the recommendation. Well, Chris, this has been a delight. Thank you again for joining this
Thank you.
conversation
I hope it wasn't
today.
too depressing.
Oh no. Well, I mean, we have to be able to deal with the hards and then turn to someone like Hannah Ritchie to help us see the possibility and the potential. So
there's a lot of research that TED has done that people prefer positive episodes. So TED typically focuses on the positive. That's one of the reasons why Hannah was on the big stage at TED. You have to be really famous to do a negative talk on TED, like Al Gore.
Sure.
And so I'm sorry this wasn't more positive, but there's so much we can do to stop eating the cows.
Amen. That's yes. Good point to dwell on. Chris, how can listeners find you and check out what you're working on these days?
That's my YouTube channel is just Plant Chompers. I amuse myself with that name. Makes me seem like militant vegan or something like that, but I just amuse myself with the name. And plantchompers.com takes you to Plant Chompers, my channel. So
terrific. Well, everyone, thanks for listening to Eating for Eden. I'll catch you next week.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to Eating for Eden. If you found this episode informative or inspiring, please consider sharing it with a friend. Climate change is an issue we all need to tackle together, so let's invite others to journey along with us as we continue the conversation and start taking action. Until next week, friends, take care.